never thought I would see this day, and now it's here. I just wish my husband had been alive to see this. He passed away in 2011. And I know he's up there with her. And they're smiling, saying, it's over. It's finally over.
Committing a crime is a heinous act. But what if it is never solved and justice never gets served due to unforeseen circumstances? The stories that I am going to share with you today took so many years to get resolved that the conclusion of them might seem bittersweet. The families of the victims had given up on ever getting justice, but technological advancements paved the way for them.
It seemed very surreal to see that this is really happening. Definitely felt anger. I mean, that we have a face to and a name to the person who brutally murdered her. But we look forward to looking for justice for her.
Our first case is of Gladys Arellano. It was January 27, 1996, when a 17-year-old Gladys Arellano went missing from her home in Boyle Heights, Los Angeles, California. She was a young girl with tall ambitions. She was ready to conquer the world. Gladys' family reported her missing the same day she failed to return, and the investigations began their search for her. The hope was there that Gladys would be found until the unimaginable happened. 3 days later, on January 30th, a body was reported. It was Gladys' body located 34 miles from downtown Los Angeles, tossed into a ravine in a remote area of Topanga. Her autopsy showed that she was assaulted and later murdered. Investigations began, and DNA was collected off her body, after which a DNA profile was made. The investigators were quite confident that they would find a match rather quickly, but to their surprise and disappointment, there was no match. After several attempts on finding the culprit, there was no other evidence to work with, and the case went cold for over 25 years. Decades later, in November 2019, a man named Jose Luis Garcia was arrested for domestic assault. According to the laws in California, Garcia was required to submit his DNA sample. Little did the officers know that this unrelated crime would help them in solving a case that had long gone cold. The officers got a warrant to compare his DNA to the crime scene of Gladys back in 1996. Unfortunately, this took quite a while, and Garcia was released and had moved back to Dallas in the meantime.
Pathologists analyzed it and determined that it matched the unidentified offender's sample obtained from the body of Gladys Arellano in 1996.
The Texas federal law enforcement didn't waste any time in arresting him and asked him questions about the incident that took place back in 1996. But he claimed that he had no idea about it, even though his DNA proved to be a direct match. At the time of Gladys' murder, Garcia was only 1 year older than her, but the true motives of the murder have not been revealed as of yet. Garcia was not found guilty and is still awaiting a trial. He is currently being held on $1 million bail. After 25 years, a bit of sheer luck revealed Gladys' true murderer, but it may take more time for justice to finally be served.
Gladys was only 17 when she was murdered. She had a beautiful soul. She was beautiful, intelligent, gorgeous, and had a radiant smile. She had such big dreams for her life. My grandparents would have been so proud of her. It was extremely painful for all of us to lose her and live through 24 and a half years of not knowing who killed her.
Our next case is similarly unfortunate, and it took even longer for it to be solved. Wendy Jerome, a 19-year-old teenager, was sexually assaulted, beaten, and then brutally killed in 1984. It was the 2nd of November 1984 in Rochester, New York, and everyone was busy with their Thanksgiving celebrations when this horrible incident took place. It was in the evening when Wendy left her house to deliver a birthday card to her best friend who lived in the same neighborhood. She was expected home by 8 p.m. that night, but she never returned. When she did not return, her family became frantic and called the authorities for help in looking for their daughter. A few hours later, it was reported that Wendy's body was found near a dumpster behind a school. She was sexually assaulted and later brutally murdered. The investigations began and the DNA samples were collected from Wendy's body in order to find the culprit. Unfortunately, forensic technology was not as advanced in the 1980s, and no matches were found for the next few decades. 36 years later, the investigations were reopened after Wendy's mother was adamant to provide her daughter with justice. The sample was taken back in 1984 and has stayed preserved since then. It was once again entered into the DNA databases used to find relatives. Only this time, a match was found. It was a 54-year-old male named Timothy Williams who lived in Melbourne, Florida. Timothy lived in Rochester in 1984 and shared the same neighborhood as Wendy Jerome. However, the two did not know each other. Timothy was extradited back to Rochester from Florida immediately and was asked multiple questions regarding this murder. At first, he refused to recall any association with Wendy, but the amount of evidence against him was far too much to ignore. The DNA of the semen found on Wendy's body was an exact match to Timothy's DNA. There was no room for escape. He was charged with second-degree murder, but was not charged with sexual assault as those charges had been expired for over 10 years when Timothy was arrested.
And can finally tell her after 35 years they made her rust. They all cried enough for all of you. Marlene, I'm sorry it took so long.
Almost 36 years later, Wendy Jerome got justice. While it was sad that her father passed away before he could see the face of her murderer, her mother lived to see the day. She was reported saying, "I never thought I would see this day, and now it's here." Mrs. Jerome said, "I just wish my husband had been alive to see this. He passed away in 2011 and I know he's up there with her, smiling and saying it's over. It's finally over."
I thought I would see this day, and now it's here. I just wish my husband had been alive to see this. He passed away in 2011. And I know he's up there with her. And they're smiling, saying, "It's over. It's finally over."
Our last and final story will make you tremble. In November of 1980, an archaeologist found a shallow grave in a secluded desert region that contained the collections of two unidentified manslaughter casualties, a male and a female. Neither one of the casualties was wearing any clothing, nor was there any type of distinguishing proof found inside the grave site. Examiners from the Specialized Investigations Division, Homicide Detail, started an examination concerning the homicide of the two casualties. A post-mortem examination was performed, which showed that the two casualties died because of gunshot wounds, confirming that it was indeed a case of homicide. Agents subsequently began their investigations with the most common approach of that time to recognize the two victims. For a long time, all efforts to identify the victims were met with failure. Each and every tool was employed by the police to find the culprit and identify the victims, but nothing worked. During the investigation, the police created data that recognized an individual of interest by the name of Howard Neal, initially from Mississippi. They learned that Neal had been living in the town of Ludlow, California, around the same time as when the victims were killed and covered in the shallow grave. Neal was living with his partner and their young daughter at the time, but it was found that they moved out of the town soon after the victims were killed. After leaving Ludlow, Neal and his family headed out to Mississippi. He remained in Mississippi for a brief time period, and if you thought that he ran away out of guilt and fear, you're sorely mistaken. While he was in Mississippi, he killed his brother and then assaulted and killed his 13-year-old niece and her 12-year close friend. Not long after those homicides, Neil and his family left Mississippi and started traveling across the United States. The crime scenes in Mississippi were found in February 1981. By March, Neil wound up in Stockton, California. On March 6, 1981, Neil was captured for negligible robbery and arrested by the Stockton Police Department. While in custody in Stockton, the police found out that there was a warrant from Mississippi for the triple killings that he had committed. Neil was sent back to Mississippi, and in February 1982, Neil stood on trial for the Mississippi murders. He was charged as guilty and was sentenced to death. Roughly 8 years after he was sentenced, Neil's lawyer filed an appeal, arguing that Neil's psychological state showed that he was borderline mentally challenged. Testing was done, and the results showed that Neil's IQ was low enough for the judges to agree to the appeal. The Mississippi Court of Appeals reduced his capital punishment to 3 life terms, which he is still serving. The police in the Ludlow murders tried to talk to Neil, but each attempt was denied by his lawyer for the Mississippi murders. His lawyers, however, did tell the agents in California that they didn't need to look any further for a suspect in the Ludlow murders. In the decades following the Ludlow murders, DNA innovation progressed colossally. The remaining parts of the Ludlow casualties were shipped off to a lab to recover DNA samples. After a few attempts by different labs, they finally managed to create a profile. Those samples were placed into the National DNA Information Base with the expectation that a match would be made and perhaps help identify the Ludlow casualties. Unfortunately, there was no match made, and the casualties stayed unidentified for north of 40 years. The case remained cold for decades until August 2017, when Neil finally spoke to the San Bernardino County detectives. In August 2017, Senior District Attorney Investigator Steve Shumway and San Bernardino County Sheriff's Investigator Garrett Tesselar expected the examination of the Ludlow manslaughters. Shumway and Tesselar went to Mississippi to talk with Howard Neil. The main point of the meeting was to check whether Neil could help agents by giving them data about the victims' identities. He didn't give away much, but it was enough for the detectives to solve the case. He did, however, accept that the female casualty might have been from Arkansas, who had abandoned her young daughter before she began to hitchhike across the region. He also said that the female had what seemed, by all accounts, to be a twisted arm. He was unable to recollect anything about the male casualty, other than he seemed to be something of a hippie. He told agents that he picked up the couple while they were catching a ride on the turnpike. He then took the two to his home, where he got into an argument with the male. The argument was about Neil trying to make inappropriate advances towards the female. Neil told the officers that the argument turned out to be so serious that he thought that the male would most likely kill him if he didn't kill him first. Neil then shot and killed the male. Right after killing the male, Neil proceeded with his advances towards the female. The officers concluded that Neil physically assaulted her and then at some point killed her. Neil wasted no time in shipping the casualties to a confined desert region south of Highway 66, dug a shallow grave, and discarded the bodies. The female's daughter left the clue that the detectives were searching for. Christine Marie Sally was looking for her biological mother and hired a private investigator in 2018. She provided them with her DNA samples, and a positive match was found between her and the female victim. She told the investigators later that her mother's name was Pamela Diane Duffy, who had disappeared with some man called Digger Lane. She had no other information about him, apart from the fact that he was incarcerated in Virginia for a short while. After reaching out to the investigators in Virginia, They found out that the male victim was a man named William Everett Lane. His biological mother was found, who provided her DNA samples to confirm the match and the male victim's identity. For more stories like this, stay tuned to our channel and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.